Good morning. Oh, let's see. No, what happened?
Well, it's a lovely photo, but where's the real person?
It's not allowing me to start. Oh, there I am. Oh dear.
This end.
I've had this problem before where the camera doesn't work. Oh dear. I'm gonna have to restart my computer. I'll be right there.
Okay, no problem. And damn it. Yes. Okay. It's worked. Yeah, well, not right this red hot minute. Thank you. Yeah. How are you little nitwits doing? Okay, well, not getting in right now. Wait, you were there for a second.
And there I am.
You were. Yay! And there was great.
No, it's a weird thing that happens where the camera doesn't work, and then I have to restart my computer and it works.
Yay!
Okay.
We know audio is working. Let's make you a co-host. This is the way it works in Zoom.
Oh, yeah, you make me a co-host so I can.
I make you a co-host, or I let everybody share one of the two, and then you can share your screen.
Okay, let me just see if this works. So if I'm sharing my screen, there is my share, and then I have my slide.
And amazingly enough, this does not look like my screen.
Yes, there's my slideshow. So you see the first image there.
Yeah, the cover of the book.
There it is.
Okay.
Great. So that's working.
Awesome. So for right now, unshare. I have uploaded the PDF to the JGSO website.
Good.
And what I'll do is during near the beginning, before people start bailing, I'll say, and Fred has generously allowed me to share the PDF of the book with the attendees of today's talk. Here's the link, download it.
Great. Great.
Okay.
Good. Well, thank you for organizing this. How many people you think will show up?
Well, let me see. The last time I checked, I think it was 20 people were registered.
Okay.
And you know, you never know who's actually going to show up.
That's all right. I enjoy doing this.
Well, that helps. I'm very happy about that part. Okay, let me look.
Well, and actually what's amazing is that in preparing for this, I corrected a major mistake I had made in prior talks, because I thought I knew which house was my great-great-grandmother's house.
And you had the
and
wrong house?
I had the wrong house. And it turns out, and it prompted me to be in touch with the museum director, who we're in touch with. And she corrected me to say that actually, no, the house had been torn down. And there's now another building where the house was. So I now have a photograph of that building, but I realized I had never verified something. So actually, I'm very glad that you invited me to do this talk, because I probably would have continued with that misconception, you know, for
And
decades.
it never hurts to go back over your research, does it?
Well, yeah.
I just looked, 43 people counting you. So 42 people have registered.
Okay, that's great. Oh, that's wonderful.
Now, I'm going to let the screaming hordes in. Let
Okay.
me admit. Oh, wait. Oh, nah, come on, computer. There we go. And of course, it is right 10:30, so only a few people are waiting in the waiting room.
Okay.
The interesting thing about Zoom is a lot more last minute than when you have an in-person meeting.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Good morning,
How big is your
everybody.
organization there?
We will be starting soon.
Tell me a little bit about the organization.
Well, Jewish Genealogical Society of Oregon covers mostly the Portland area, which is where, like, Portland Metro is where something like 90% of the population of the state lives. There is another state society that's down the Willamette Valley. Trying to remember how many years, because I've only been up here 5 years. I've forgotten how many years it has existed, but it's a small group. It's about 50 people. Not necessarily a lot of Jews in Oregon, okay? I am now the president. I started doing programming, and then the president had some health problems, and now I'm the president.
Well, that's good. That's good.
But we have maintained our existence during COVID, which is amazing, mostly because of Zoom.
Yeah. No, it's really, it's been a marvelous educational, you know, an opportunity of being able to listen to lectures from all over the world and work with people all over the world. Yes, it's been great.
In some ways, it's a lot easier just because you don't have to worry about the logistics of people coming out to your area and putting them, you know, finding hotels and stuff, or limiting yourself to the number of people who are within easy driving distance, but it's still not the same as meeting in person.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, of course.
Just not quite. So, you know, there's a heavy Sephardic presence up in this area, more so really concentrated in Seattle, but a little bit of overflow to this area. For whatever reason, a lot of Sephardim came over to the Pacific Northwest.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so it's a very strong interest in this area, as opposed to a lot of areas where mostly it's Ashkenazi. Hooray for the Ashkenazim. Nothing personal if you're Sephardic. I just happen to be Ashkenazi. But you know, it's still harder to find speakers on Sephardic stuff. Like there's the synagogue we used to meet in was a Sephardic synagogue too.
Can you ask people to mute their audio?
Oh, that's a good point. Everybody, please mute. Well, okay, you if you don't want to for a couple minutes, but we're not really talking amongst each other, so better to mute now and be prepared. And what county is Georgetown, Texas in, Sarah? I don't know that city.
It's right outside of Austin.
Apparently Fred knows that city.
I lived in Austin for 3 years.
Oh,
Yeah,
Many decades.
covered.
Many decades.
It is just north of Austin, about 40 miles in Williamson County. Austin's in Travis County, so there's a county line in between.
See, that's why I don't know.
I used to live up in Seattle when I was college age, between high school and college for about 5 years. So
okay. I haven't done a lot of Austin research. I've done a lot of Houston and Dallas metro research, but not so much Austin.
Yeah, we moved here from Iowa. So we've been in the places where there aren't many Jews. I grew up in a Goyish neighborhood in Detroit, which was very much divided into religious neighborhoods at the time.
And where did you live in Iowa?
Out in Des Moines and outside Des Moines.
Well, on my mother's side, we have the Mark family that was in Des Moines for several generations. There was a Milton
Yes.
Mark who was a doctor.
Right, I was going to say there was a very well-known OBGYN by the name of Marks.
Mark singular M-A-R-K, and he delivered most of the Jewish kids in Des Moines for many decades. Yeah, it's my mother's second cousin. And in fact,
Small world.
I'm seeing Milton's daughter Sarah on Tuesday because she lives part-time in San Francisco now.
Yeah, and we have a friend who used to run the Jewish home in Des Moines who now lives in Portland. And he's quite interested in genealogy, but I don't think he's aware of your society.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Well, you know, it's amazing how many people don't, if they don't look, they don't find it. Like the Bay Area JGS has been around for more than 40 years, and we would do presentations and stuff. Would say, I didn't know there was a Jewish genealogy society here. So, you know, it's really common that people just, if there's not enough publicity, no matter how much publicity you do. And there's Riva from the Willamette Valley JGS, the one I was mentioning earlier. Hi, Riva.
You know, I'm going to quickly send him this link if that's okay.
That's perfectly fine. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to mute you now, Sarah. And I'm muting you, Riva, just in case. Oh, there's our treasurer coming in. We have our secretary. Yep, mute, mute. Uh-oh, that one didn't mute. There it goes. Go zapping crazy. Mute, 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 mute. Hey, wait a minute. Why isn't that one muting? Huh. Maybe that person's not on a computer. And it's just 10:30 now, because I know people tend to trickle in at the last minute from here. Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to give another couple minutes for people to show up. We actually have 43 people registered today, which is exciting. Even for our Zoom meetings, that's a pretty healthy number. So we'll get going in a couple minutes. If you're not muted, I am muting you as you come in, but don't worry, you'll get to talk later. And I'm excited to hear this talk today too, because when Fred presented it in the Bay Area, I didn't get to go.
Oh, you weren't there. That's right.
No, but I don't think you were in Oakland. I think I had you at the other two. Anyway, I didn't get to hear the talk, so I get to hear the talk.
Well, this is great. This is great. And I did hear from a woman named Paulina who couldn't attend, but I sent her the link to the book. And there's a YouTube video of my 2012 presentation in San Francisco.
Aha.
So I sent her that as well. But she said she was teaching a citizenship class, so she couldn't attend this morning. And you're recording this, right? So
yes, this is being recorded. I'll announce that too. Oh, thank you, Riva. I appreciate that. Riva told everybody it's the Jewish Genealogical Society of the Willamette Valley in Oregon. That's the other yes, we have 2 JGSs in Oregon. Oh, and somebody named Myra. My mother's name was Myra. It's a wonderful name. Yes, now that it's a little after 10:30, they're streaming in.
Good.
Let's see who else do we have. We have our treasurer, we have our secretary. Well, we don't have the other officers, but sometimes they show up later.
It's all right.
Okay. We have a healthy number of people for your presentation.
Good.
It's the important part. Excuse me. Come on, computer, behave yourself. There we go. Tick, 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 tick. Maybe one more minute. The huge flow of people right after 10:30 has trickled. And I want to get my URL ready so I can tell people about their present they're getting today. Let's see, go back there. Yep, there's somebody else. Happy to see so many people here today. Without a mute possibility. Now that's interesting. What does that mean they're doing? Are they on phones? Okay, I'm going to start now. Morning, everybody. Hello, Barry. I am Janice Sellers. I'm the president of the Jewish Genealogical Society of Oregon. I'm happy to see so many people here this morning. Okay, I got a ding dong. Why did I get a ding dong? I don't know. Let me see. Got to remember my housekeeping notes. This presentation is being recorded. If you do not want your face to appear on screen, just make sure you keep your camera off. If for some reason you don't want your name at all to appear on screen, you can rename yourself. I have enabled the closed captions for the presentation. So at the bottom of your screen on the nav bar, you should see something that says live transcript and a little box with CC. You can click the caret to the side of that and you can turn on or off the closed captions as you prefer. Let's see what else. I'm forgetting something. Well, if it's important. Oh, I know what it is. It's the question part. Fred will be giving his presentation. During that time, we want everyone to stay muted. If you have questions, you can enter them into the chat. After his presentation is finished, I will do the questions in chat first. And then if we still have more questions, we'll be happy to take live people at the end of that. Fred's an awesome person. We're thrilled to have him here today. And as I mentioned earlier, I didn't actually get to see this presentation when he did it in the Bay Area. So now I get to see it. I'm very excited about that. And let me see, I think that's everything I need to worry about. And I'm going to turn it over to Fred. Oh, wait, one last thing. Those lucky people who are in attendance today, I am putting a URL in the chat. Fred has generously allowed me to share the PDF of the book he is discussing. So if you go to that link, you can download the PDF and you'll be able to read it at home in its entirety in your spare time. But for now, we're going to hear Fred talk about the discovery of the diary and how he and his cousin ended up publishing it and sharing it with the rest of the world. Thank you, Fred, and I look forward to this very much.
Great. Good morning, everybody. I'm really thrilled to be able to do this. It's a wonderful project that we have been working on for the last, now I can say, 14 years, and since we first discovered the diary. And I want to just say that if you can imagine wanting to wake up your great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents and ask them how they ended up coming to America, well, through the amazing luck and fortune of this story, that's exactly what I've been able to do. And I want to just start. I'm going to show you, it's going to be a slideshow in a moment, but I just thought you would enjoy seeing, this is my favorite picture of my great-grandfather, David, probably taken when he was about 30. And most importantly, you see he has a tie and a vest on. He's almost always with a tie and a vest, as you will see. And this is a really precious one. This is his wedding photo from 1887, I'm sorry, when he was 24 years old, and we'll hear more about that. So I want to just start by saying that as I've gone through this process, and this is, I say this especially for a genealogical group, I realize there are 4 different perspectives or lenses one has on one's family story. One is the story you grew up with, the family you grew up with. We all have our family stories. And then we have, obviously, in this story, the discovery of the diary, which I will tell you about. We then have the internet, which we didn't have 30 years ago, but we have now. And then lastly, and this is the part I'm going to tell about, is we have the roots journey. And one of the things I learned on that roots journey is there's a lot more to know than just what you find on the internet. So let me share my screen here. And hopefully now, is that working? You're seeing the cover of the book?
I'm seeing it just fine. I hope
Right.
everyone else is. If anyone has any technical problems, send me a message through the chat.
Okay, so this is the cover of the book. And let me find out why it's not allowing me to, oh, there it is. Okay, so this is David Blumenfeld. He is one of my 8 great-grandparents. I would say I have one of the most uniquely boring, what I call uniquely boring Jewish genealogies, which is that all 8 of my great-grandparents lived in either St. Paul or Minneapolis, Minnesota by 1884. You know, it's uniquely boring in the sense that they all showed up in Minnesota. The other piece of it is that 3/4 of them are from within 100 miles of each other, which in an area which was then called Courland. Courland is Western Latvia. It was a separate duchy in the 16th and 17th century. For a while, it was even controlled by Sweden. It then became part of Russian Empire in 1805 and was part of the Russian Empire until it became independent Latvia in 1918. And this actually is a little note of one of the most confusing things about this, which is through much of Jewish history, the people stayed, but the nationalities changed. And that's an important thing that shapes this history. The other thing about Courland is that it was not in the Pale of Settlement. It was part of really the German empire, social culture. It was not part of East Prussia. East Prussia was Western Lithuania to the south. I'll show a map later, but Courland was 80% German in the 19th century, German Christians and German Jews. So, and only about 20% Latvian. So this is our ancestor, David Blumenfeld, shortly before he died in the 1950s. And one of the things that's been wonderful about this journey is that fortunately my family saved a lot of things. And when we first started on this journey, I asked my mother whether she had any more records of him. And in fact, this is a handwritten note by David, probably written in about the 1920s or 30s, saying that he was born in Tukums. He spells it Tuckums, Courland, which he spells with a K, Russia, because that's what it was at the time. In 1863, came to America in 1884, shortly before his 21st birthday, ended up in Ludington, Michigan. He later met his wife, Leah, and they married in 1886, and I showed you their wedding photo. Another mystery problem with Jewish genealogy, David's mother was named Leah, as was his wife. So there's often confusion about which Leah are we talking about when we're talking about different Leah. Now, why is this not moving? Oh dear, hang on a second here. There we go. Okay, so just to clue you in who everybody is, there I am. There is my mother, Lorraine, still alive at 98. We're planning her 99th birthday party for August. There is her father, my grandfather, Al, his father, David, our protagonist. And then we have David's parents. And this is a little sneak preview of another genealogical problem. His mother was always known as Leah Gottschalk. That's what it says on her tombstone. Ben Zion, Blumenfeld, his father, and then his paternal grandfather and his maternal grandfather, who we knew as Yaakov Gottschalk. Now, this is my favorite family photo. This was taken actually shortly before I was born, so I'm not in it, but it really gives you a sense of the family I grew up with. We have my sister and my brother. We have my mother, Lorraine, and my late father, Mark. We have my mother's father, Al, and then we have our protagonist, David. Again, even though it's the middle of the summer and it's a family event, there he is with his vest and tie. This was taken in about 1951. So just to tell the story of David before we deep dive into the family story, this is David, age 24, marrying Leah, perfectly dressed there in Minneapolis. There he is, and there is Lena with her grandchildren, two of their grandchildren. This is Lena as a grown woman, a very formidable woman. David didn't actually like her very much. It's one of the pieces of the diary where he talks about how difficult his wife was and how unpleasant she was. But they were a very well-established Midwest Jewish family, educated, ambitious, moderately successful. This is their eldest daughter, Belle, as a high school student, and then as the woman I knew much later. Then there is my grandpa, Al. This really shows the Americanization of the family. Here he is in his World War I uniform. He had the good fortune to be scheduled to ship out to Europe in November of 1918, and the war ended about a week before he was to be shipped out. So he actually never served, but there he is in his sergeant uniform. And the story of these people is important because Al was the second to the least favorite grandson, and his sister Helen, was the most disliked by David. She was the artist and free thinker. If somebody hasn't muted, please mute your mic, please. So Helen was there. She is in her Isadora Duncan phase, and there she is as an older woman. Helen was an atheist communist who ran off to Dallas and then Los Angeles with her communist husband. And in fact, the stories of these children is very important to the diary story, which I will explain. And here we have the two favored children of David, Mose, later known as Joseph, who went on to be a federal judge in Connecticut, and Belle, his intellectual, artistic daughter. And there we have David and Lena shortly before her death, holding their first great grandchild. So that's what I knew about my family. I knew nothing about what happened before they got to America, and I knew nothing about any of their relatives. But we did know a fair amount about David. We knew that he first was a tailor, and this is an ad from the Minneapolis Tribune. And we then know that in 1902, he set out for the wilds of South St. Paul, Minnesota. And one of the interesting things, and this comes out in the diary and other places, is that there was a tradition at the time that Jews shouldn't compete with other Jews. So if you were going to set up a men's clothing store, you would go to a place where there wasn't already a Jewish-owned men's clothing store. And that's where they came with South St. Paul. I want you to keep this image in mind when we compare it to where he left from. And unlike many Jews who went from shtetls to big cities, I think that this was somewhat of a downwardly mobile move, as you will see. But it was mostly known at that time, South St. Paul, for the meat packing industry. It's where the cattle were slaughtered, non-kosher meat, I would say, point out. And David figured out that if you want to have a men's clothing store, you should open it near where there's a lot of men who need to buy clothes. So these are the images of South St. Paul. And you'll see here that by 1910, he was a prominent member of the local business community, the only one, I would say, wearing, again, a vest and tie. You see him there, very distinguished. He was at that point about 45 years old, and that's where he was in South St. Paul. And this is one of the few photos. The store was sadly torn down for urban renewal in the 1970s, but you have this great image of the American Jewish businessman. There he is, again, in his suit, in his vest and tie, with his 3 employees there. I guess I would say late 40s, probably, by the fashions. And so this was the image we had of David Blumenfeld. Now, most important for our story, you can't really see into it, but in the back of the store, there was a little study where David spent every morning ignoring his duties as a shopkeeper, but doing what he really cared about was to write. And I have to say, there's many tender parts of this story, and one of them is that his family didn't really respect his writing, whether it's that he wasn't famous or he wasn't rich. He was derisively known as the pencil pusher. He wasn't really admired for what he did, but he got some recognition. And for example, here we have an article from the South St. Paul newspaper where he is honored for his writing. And here we have an amazing document that we got from the South St. Paul Public Library, where it describes that he has recently written his 2nd book on the history of Russia. And it says here the story going back to the time of his grandfather, Yanka Hennis. And you want to keep that name in mind because it's a very relevant name for this story. A wealthy Jewish leather merchant of Tukums, Russia, now known as Latvia. And as it shows here, born in 1863, emigrated in 1884, first to Ludington and then to Minneapolis. So this is like the summary of the story captured in a 1925, I think 1925, 1928, I can't remember the date, article from the South St. Paul newspaper. And we see they then featured when he wrote another book of poems about Israel, and then his death in 1955, where he was recognized for that. So we knew there were books. These are the books. He never got a publisher to take any of his books. We had, in fact, we have the rejection letters from Doubleday and other places. But by the 1950s, he was rich enough, or 40s, to do what we now would call self-publishing, which was then called the Vanity Press. And he had 3 of his books published. One is a novel, interestingly, about a Jewish merchant who tries to make money supplying arms to Germany in World War I. It doesn't go well. And then his 2 books of poetry. And I grew up with boxes of these books in the basement of our home. Now, one of the stories that I actually do remember from my childhood was that there was a box of unpublished manuscripts that had gone missing. And we would often search for them in my grandmother's attic. We would ask about them, but we never found them. Then, fortunately, I mentioned that Helen was sort of the wild child. Helen's daughter, who, important to the story, converted to Christianity, Episcopalian, married another poet. She was a renowned poet, ended up in Seattle. And my mother, fortunately, had stayed in touch with them. So I knew them and knew their kids. And at one point in early 2008 or late 2007, I happened to be in Seattle, and I spent the day with my mother's cousin and my cousins, including Sean Bentley. And we became friends and we traded stories. And about 6 months later, I got a call from Sean, who said, "Sit down, you're not going to believe this. I was cleaning out my house in preparation for a move, And in the room, actually his basement laundry room where he had stored all of the documents from his late father, who was a very prominent poet, as I said, was a box, and he opened it, and there was the box of lost manuscripts from our great-grandfather. How did they end up there? Well, it turns out that when my great-grandfather died in 1955, his daughter Belle, knowing that Beth was a writer, thought, aha, she's a writer, she will appreciate these manuscripts. She sent them to Beth, who found them either unpleasant or offensive or just totally uninteresting, put them in a box and probably never read most of them, but fortunately didn't throw them away, eventually giving them to her son, who also didn't know what they were and didn't look at them, but didn't throw them away. And there they were. And 7 of them are not very good novels about Jews and non-Jews. They're stories of the Vatican and the Pope, and they're quite elaborate novels. But one of them just jumped out, and it is called Diary. That's the simple name of it, just Diary. So what is the diary? It is a fictionalized version of the family story. And what we love is reading this intro, and the names are changed, but it's pretty obvious who everybody is. Benze is Ben Zion, and Lynetta is clearly Leah, his wife. And as it says here, while fortune smiled on many of these immigrants who acquired wealth and positions which enabled them to write their lives with golden letters on the pages of New World history, the successful ones were only a small minority. The majority, like Benze, failed in their efforts to acquire a decent competency, mostly due to their tenacious loyalty to their faith and conscientiousness in their religious activities. This became a stumbling block to their material success in life. Now, this is a perspective that most 21st century Jews wouldn't know what they're talking about. And I would refer you to Hasia Diner, D-I-N-E-R's wonderful books. She has one on the history of 19th century Jewry and American Jews, and another one specifically on the history of the peddlers. And the two key Jewish activities: working on Saturday and keeping kosher. If you wanted to be successful, you had to, especially, obviously in retail we're talking about, you had to be open on Saturday. Why? Because retail stores in America were closed on Sunday for the Christian Sabbath, and Saturday was the day of shopping because workers had to work Monday through Friday. So the other was being willing to live in a town that didn't have kosher meat. And that theme of going to these small towns, especially in the Midwest, for Jews who were not in New York, not in Chicago, they had to be willing to give up kashrut. So this again, and here we have the story in the diary paralleling the narrative handwritten note I showed you beginning about how they ended up in Ludington, and Benze became a peddler. And within a year, we think it's more likely 2 years, he saved enough money to send home for steamship tickets for his family. And there they were, as he describes, to get their start in the land flowing with milk and honey. You may think that Matt referred to Palestine, but no, it is there. And this explains how David, known as Nate in the book, was going to go west. He only got to Chicago. And this answered a question we had never known, which is why, of the 4 children, why is it that my grandfather was born in Chicago? We now know because David took his family to Chicago to make money. It didn't really work. He then left Chicago and went back to Minneapolis, having failed to make a living in Chicago. That's why he ended up in Minneapolis. And as we saw, we had him in his success as a tailor. And then, as we said, going to South St. Paul. Okay, so that's what we knew from the diary, but we wanted to learn more. So we start by looking at the internet. Now, one of the most precious documents we have here, and it just led to this wonderful interaction. Before there was the internet, my father in 1995 started to search for his parents' family, also from Courland, from Western Latvia. And this is a letter back from the Jewish archivist in Riga saying that they have actually, they do have records going back to 1854, and they have the records. And if my father would like to have it, they would send these references and the genealogical table for $250. My father somehow found it offensive that they were asking for money. He thought this should be delivered for free. He never sent them the $250, and thus he never got the information. I just have to say a little preview here. 20 or 15 years after this letter was written, I had the pleasure of showing it to the current Jewish archivist in the National Library in Riga, and she got a real kick of seeing what her predecessor had sent my father in 1997. So what did we find on the internet? Again, completely verifying what we had seen in the diary. Here is the Hamburg-Glasgow ship record of going to America on the Prague in August of 1884. And there we have, this is not Ben Zion, the father who came in 1882. This is the wife and 6 kids. And here we see the Blumenfeld family, Leah. We see David, who by then is 21, Chaim, Simcha, Friedel, Rachel, and Margala. And this is very interesting because this is our only example of what their pre-American first names were. David did not change his name, but as we see later, Chaim became Herman, Simcha became Sarah, Friedel became Frida, Rachel became Ruth, and Margala became Margaret. And we see that David was a Schneider, which is a tailor. So again, matching up, and we see they are all from Tukums. There you have it. But David was a tailor. We then have the records from their ship from Glasgow on to New York. And one of the funny things here, Leah has somehow become Laban, and she somehow has transitioned from female to male. And this is one of these great examples of a clerk's error that kind of then haunts them for the records and creates lots of confusion because Leah has become Laban, but all the other names are accurate and their stories are accurate there. So again, confirmation, the diary and the internet ship records tell the same story. Now, we wanted to know more. And so our decision to go to Latvia was triggered by this first section of the diary. And here we have David in 1922 telling the story of his birth in 1864, describing his mother sitting on the veranda of their 2-story dwelling overlooking the marketplace in Tukums. And this is my favorite lines. The marketplace was smoothly paved with gray cobblestones, kept scrupulously clean. What stories these worn stones could tell. And he describes how one day a week it was a city market with peasants bringing in their produce. One day was the volunteer bucket brigade drill, and 4 days for military drills. Now, here is a description of 1864, written in 1922, typed in 1944, and in 2012, I was able to read this and hand this to the director of the City Museum of Tukums. And she, for the first time, could read a description of her town 160 years prior to when I showed it to her. So we then decided we needed to go to Tukums. So here you have Tukums in Western Latvia. You see that. And this area here of Western Lithuania is formerly East Prussia. And just to see that the family went by carriage to Klaipėda, where they caught what's called a tramp schooner. It's a sort of coastal hugging ship that took them to Hamburg, probably more to Kiel, which is just north of Hamburg. They called it Hamburg Port. They probably then went through the Kiel Canal rather than going over Denmark. I'm a little unclear whether they could. The Kiel Canal probably may not have been fully built. They may have gone overland and then would have gone to Glasgow and on to New York. So we flew to Riga, the capital, and before setting on to Tukums. Now, before we went, we again did our internet research and we found these images of Tukums. At this point, not knowing what it looked like. And here, very importantly, you want to see this blue shop here to the right of the church. This is going to play a very important part of our story. And we found a few wonderful historic photos. Again, you see the shop here on the right there. And again, the shop here with a group of soldiers. This is actually 1928, 10 years after the founding of the country of Latvia. And a few little images we found of the city of Tukums, but having no idea of what it looked like now. So we landed in Riga, and the most important institution in terms of Jewish history of Latvia is the Jewish Museum, which is in the Jewish Community Center in Riga. It's a wonderful museum and great exhibits and great story. And we were able to meet with Ilya Lenski, who is still there, who's the director of the museum. He's not the founder. There was a guy named Ben Millis, I think Ben Malis, and now Ilya Lenski is there. And Ilya, again, opened the doors. And one of the things I may just say here, that as you're going through these searches, you know, you hit dead ends and then you have doors that open. And we had not yet gone to Tukums. We started in Riga, and Ilya brought out a book and said, well, you're in luck because the director of the city museum has published a book on all of the buildings of Tukums. And he went into the index, and there he found the page which shows the family store. And one of the things that I'll just mention it now, because it was another key that opened up a door, was that we could never find anything about the Gottschalk family. Well, it was Ilias who explained that Gottschalk was the Americanized name, and the German name was Klatzow. And you'll see here in small print here, Klatzow. And he then explained that when people had to Latvianize names, the name became Klatziu. So, and, you know, I have to say, if we hadn't gone to that museum and met with Ilias, I'm not sure I ever would have learned what the Latvian name was, that it's Klatziu, not Gottschalk, not even Klatzow. And without that name, none of the rest of the story would have unfolded. So we then, he gave me another thing. He gave me two amazing keys. One is he gave me the name of Klatziu, and secondly, he gave me the director of the museum's cell phone number, because it happened the day we were going to go to Tukums. Unbeknownst to us, the museum was closed. But in fact, he gave me her cell phone, and I called her, and she happily met with us. And here we are, we're arriving in Tukums. There is my cousin Sean taking the pictures. There's my nephew Noah. there's my sister Deborah, and there in the white jacket is Agrita Ozola, who's been a real hero to us in this journey. This is her assistant, whose name I can't remember. And we then found ourselves in Tukums. We did hire a guide for one day. If you're at all interested in Latvian Jewish history and Lithuanian, Alexander Svaikmanis is your guy. He has a website called Baltic Gen, and he is the leading historian. He is Jewish. He grew up there. He has a PhD in Jewish history, and we hired him from the day. He was wonderful in terms of telling us everything that had happened going back to the early 1800s, and he was our guide. That is Alexander. And here we have the square described by David Blumenfeld. I'm going to get emotional now. Here is that square with the polished cobblestones, unchanged for 160 years. It's all there. And so here is a photo just to show you of it with the cattle from the neighbors. Here's an example of a postcard. You see things are in Russian and in German, and a little photo montage done by my partner, who's a great photographer. Here it is, still there 164 years later, with my nephew sitting on the park bench. Now we went to search for the house and the shop of the Klatzoffs. And here we found this old photo, and we thought, well, here's a house with a second-story veranda. Here's another one. Maybe these are the Klatzoff houses. Still there. Although we learned that this house, abandoned, was owned by a different Jewish family, still fighting over the house in 2012. And we thought, well, maybe this is the house, but actually it turns out that this was not the house. And in fact, the house had since been torn down. This is a contemporary photo showing a two-story building with a balcony, but it is a new building because the Klatzoff house was torn down. And then in looking for the store, and this is key to the whole story here, was what was the family store? Now another name problem, Janka Hennes. That just drove us crazy. Was Hennes the surname? Was Hennes the surname? No. In those early years, people didn't have surnames, or they didn't use them if they even had them. They were known sometimes by their patrilineal, Yankel, son of Joseph. In this case, they were known, their second name was their wife's name. So when we learned that Yankov Klatzoff's wife was Hannah, we knew we had the right person, because here is Janka Hennes. And as it says here, he had a large corner store where he conducted a business in leather, shoemakers, harness makers, and leather findings and supplies, and peasants visited his shop, for knowledge of his honesty had spread. And there we have a photo with some soldiers, but also some peasants lined up in front of his store. And so here we have the family story, the fictionalized diary, and the photos still showing them. Now, this is where things got dramatic. And let me just say, we kept wanting to talk about the 19th century, and I would say within 10 minutes, you're in 1941. 1941 is the year that the Nazis took Latvia, which had been a short time run by the Soviets, then Latvia, and the Nazis took it over. And in the first month, almost all of the Latvian Jews were murdered. And when I said to the museum director, who had these dioramas of the central square of Tukums, what happened to the Klatzoff store? And she said, oh, it was demolished in the 1940s. And I said, why? And she said, I surmise that the family was killed by the Nazis. And those are such profound statements. First of all, they were actually killed mostly by other Latvians who helped the Nazis, but in their conception, they were killed by the Nazis. And in a town that was 50% Jewish prior to that time, there is no mention of Jews in the city museum at all. we were the first people to really bring this to their attention. Let me say there was some awareness, but no mention in the museum. So this is the building that held the family store. We also learned where the Blumenfeld family was. And as David told in the story, the Blumenfelds were much humbler than the Klatzoffs, and we could surely see this, whereas the Klatzoffs had a grand house on the town square, the Blumenfelds had a shabby little house a couple of blocks away, but still there. We then went to the synagogue, and this is a 19th century photo of the synagogue. And again, this is how it looks now. It's now a gymnasium where the women's galleries are now the bleachers for watching gym. And to their credit, there is a little plaque here that says it is the site of a former Jewish synagogue. And inside there actually is a placard with 3 or 4 panels of the Jewish history. My partner, the photographer, decided we should envision what would it like to replace the Jewish imagery on that synagogue as it is now. We then walked around the city and saw how much of it is totally intact. And as in most Roots trips, ended up at the cemetery. We actually could not find any graves, and Feigmanis has done a listing of the names, and for reasons we really can't understand, even with all the different names, we could not find their history. And then just to complete our capturing of David Blumenfeld's story, my partner and I took the train from Vilnius to Memel, now Klaipėda. This is an image of the tramp schooner that they would have taken from Memel, which now looks like this. And we followed again in David's footsteps, or in his boat cruise itinerary, and took the boat to Hamburg. So before I go into the discussion of Torn Family Reunited, let me just tell you that we had a plan. It kind of went dormant for years, but has now been revived. We have donated the David Blumenfeld's materials to the Upper Midwest Jewish Archives in Minneapolis, the University of Minnesota. And we are now working on a plan to have an exhibit at the Tukums Museum telling the story of David Blumenfeld's immigration from Latvia, using the materials that I've just shown you, and actually having a parallel exhibit at the University of Minnesota on the Minnesota perspective of his life, showing what it is to go from a small town in Latvia to a small town in the Midwest. When I first landed in Latvia, I had this profound insight, which is that my family left a flat, boring, forested place with bad weather, and they arrived in another flat, boring, forested place with bad weather. So let me just end by telling you briefly about how our torn family became reunited. Now, this is in David's handwriting, because one of his novels, which we actually have a summary of it in handwriting, not typed, he had them typed in 1940s, but one of his novels was called A Torn Family Reunited. Nothing to do with our family, but I just thought I should title this in David Blumenfeld's honor. So as I said, when I was in Riga, I finally got the right spelling of the Latvianized name. And when I had heard that the family, many of the family were killed in the Holocaust, I went online, entered the name into the Yad Vashem database, and there was David Klatziu. You see, I got the spelling there. David Hirsch. Hirsch was his middle name, and born in 1854 and was murdered in 1941. Here is the English version. And you see it's even a slightly different spelling Klatsu, Klatcu, instead of CEU, but I found it. Born in Tukums in 1854 to Yaakov and Hannah, again confirming Yaakov Hennes. He was a leather merchant, again confirming it. And he was killed in 1941 based on this testimony from his daughter. And that just was riveting, because there at the bottom, and if you can read Hebrew, it says it's been submitted by his daughter, Devorah Traub, who lived in Haifa in 1955. And that name, Traub, just resonated with me. I called my mother, who has a very good memory. She did then, of course. And I said, do we have any cousins in Israel named Traub? And she said, no, we have no cousins in Israel. She called me back the next day and said, I just remembered that in the 1950s, a family named Traub came to visit us in Minnesota. I had no idea how I was related to them. I never heard from them again, but we do have cousins in Israel named Traub. Well, this sent me on my journey. I then learned from another friend that the Mogen Adom Red Cross of Israel still in 2012 has a Holocaust reunification program. And I sent them this document. And about a week later, I got an email from a woman saying, my name is Ada Harari, and I am your fourth cousin. What they had done is the woman who had written this, of course, has since died. They went into her probate records. They found her daughter's name, who had since died, and they found her granddaughter, who then wrote to me. And after 140 years and 3 generations later, I was on email with my fourth cousin. My cousin Sean, who's a far better internet researcher than I am, then found on the internet a family tree of a family we're not really related to, very distantly. But this again was the key, because it turned out that David Klatzoff had 1 son and 6 daughters. Well, daughters, I'm a big fan of daughters, but they are the ultimate challenge for genealogical research, because the names change. And here was this other key, because here we have the married names. Some wonderful person in 1949 wrote this, and some wonderful person in the 1990s posted it on the internet on Jewish Gen. And here we have their surnames: Samanoff, Jacobson, Rashal, Drubkin, we now know as Drabkin, and Korting and Hirschman. And it says here, Mr. Drubkin, son, resides in Riga. And we had just gone to Riga, and we thought, oh my God, we could have met them in Riga. And the other, Hannah, married Mr. Korting and lives in San Francisco in 1949. Well, we then went to work. My cousin reached out and basically called everybody named Korting in America he could find. And lo and behold, he finds Paul Korting, a fundamentalist Christian who I think lives in Las Vegas, and says, well, I have nothing to do with this family anymore, but my cousin, Paul, lives in San Francisco. And as far as I learned, Yoel and the Drabkin family migrated to California in the late 1970s, part of the Soviet Jewish immigration. So I then went on the search for everybody named Drabkin, and it turns out there's a dentist named Drabkin in San Leandro, about 20 minutes from my house. And I called him up, and I got to say to him, my name is Fred Hertz, and I am your fourth cousin. My family left left Tukums in 1882, and he left Riga in 1982. And here we are reunited. This is Victor and Mikhail Drabkin. Their father, Julius, unfortunately died before I could speak to them. This is Mikhail's son, and this is in my home in Oakland. And the next year when I was in Israel, I spent the day with Ada and Tammy, my fourth cousins in Israel. So this is the story that we have. And I tell you that we then, following in David Blumenfeld's footsteps, we tried to get the novel published. We failed. We have rejection letters, just as David did. And my mother at some point said, well, we're just going to do it ourselves. And the book that you see there is a compilation. Just to tell you, I changed the names back to the real family names so that my family could follow it. The other thing is there's about a fourth of the book are what I call historic sidebars. I have a few of them in the book. And then what we did in a kind of Talmudic fashion, my two cousins from Seattle, my sister and I have our commentaries on the book on the right and the left side. And we also have essays by my mother and my sister and other people. And that is the book we have published. And what I learned, first of all, I learned that the family migration had very little to do with anti-Semitism. There was some anti-Semitism. There were these May laws. There were some restrictions, but it had much more to do with Ben Zion's failure. He'd gone to Crimea, had a flour mill that was destroyed. His rich father-in-law was tired of supporting him. There's a lot in the diary about the family conflicts. And so what I learned is that his migration had much more to do with family conflict and economic quest for success and dreams of wealth. I also learned that of David's family, he's the only one who was successful. Although, by the way, I did learn from my internet research that 8 years after he arrived in America, he actually did file bankruptcy, but he restored his credit to open a family store, but that his siblings disappeared, died, failed. And I learned also about what my great-grandfather thought about my grandfather, which was universally negative. And in some ways, I learned a lot about myself by learning about this family story. So that's the story, and I'm happy to talk about any questions, answer any questions you have.
In chat, because I was, and I'm still a little confused who David Klatzoff is in Tukums, but
David Klatzoff was
what you found. He is related to the Blumenfelds.
Yeah, David Blumenfeld's wife was Leah Gottschalk. Gottschalk is the Americanized name of Klatzoff, and David Klatzoff is the brother of Leah.
Okay.
So David Klatzoff was Ben Zion's brother-in-law, David Blumenfeld's uncle.
Okay. Thank you. Now I'm clear on that. Now, I was the only question in chat, so if anybody else has questions, please use the little widget down in the bar, nav bar, to raise your hand, just in case we have a whole bunch of people lined up. I can keep you in order. And I did notice we have a Blumenfeld attending. We have Mike Blumenfeld here. Is he one of your Blumenfelds?
Ask him. I don't know.
Ah, so not one that you know of, and he's shaking his head. I just noticed Blumenfeld.
And where does Mike Blumenfeld live?
New York.
And are you related to me?
I don't think so. None of the names come through as being familiar, but except for the name.
Well, the other Blumenfelds in New York, there was a George Blumenfeld who worked for the New York school system.
No.
And that's the only Blumenfeld in New York. I should tell you, there were 43 Blumenfelds in Tukums in the 1880s. It was a very common name.
I know
Which still
nothing
doesn't necessarily mean they were related.
It
Yeah.
might have been. And where's your family from?
I don't know. I'm ashamed to say. I know it's from Eastern Europe, but I don't know any of the particulars. They were all gone before I was born. One was left, but she had dementia, and I never had a relationship.
Well, one of the lines I heard, somebody says, by the time you get around to wanting to ask questions of your family, they're either dead or unable to answer them.
And a lot of times you find out you're the oldest one left in the family.
I am the oldest survivor, yes.
Well, does anybody have questions of Fred? Come on, speak up. Somebody's gonna want to ask something. But it was really interesting, and I'm glad I finally got to hear it. And if you haven't looked in chat, I did put a link. You can download the PDF of the book that Fred and Sean edited from David's original diary. So you can read all the details. Thank you very much, Fred, for offering to share that with attendees.
Of course.
May I ask that you post your email address so that I can write to you and invite you to give the same talk in Eugene?
Sure. Yeah. It's Fred at frederickhertz.com. FRED at FREDERICKHERTZ.com. Fred at frederickhertz.com.
Thank you.
I found it very interesting that it was a German Jewish population in that area of Latvia. My family's all German Jewish from Germany, from West Germany.
So here's what happened in the late 1700s and early 1800s. There was a push where basically poor German Jews were invited, or business savvy Jews were invited by the Tsar's wife, Tsarina, into Courland to develop the area. So German Christians and German Jews moved there and became the bourgeoisie of Western Latvia. By the 19th century, 80% of Western Latvia was German. And in 1918, the German Christians were basically deported to Germany. And many of the German Jews left for St. Petersburg and Moscow. So by the 19th century, they were seen as Latvian Jews, but their ethnicity was German. They actually spoke a dialect, what's called Juddeutsch, which is a German dialect that is somewhat like Yiddish, but much more German and has almost no Polish in it. And yes, I just saw a question in the chat here. Anybody whose name is Courlander, Courland or Courlander are people who came from Courland. As to David's education, that's an interesting question. He never went to high school. He was apprenticed as a tailor in 1910, and when he was 10, I'm sorry, and he was totally self-educated. And his English, yes, I mean, he did the rhyme verse in English. I will tell you that when we look at his handwritten manuscripts in his diary, there's a lot of grammatic errors. We can see that the typist cleaned up his English a little bit when they went to type it. He had a slightly, you could see the German grammatic errors, the Germanized grammatic errors. But yes, he was really self-taught and he never went to high school even.
Sarah has a question for you. Don't forget to unmute, Sarah.
Okay, I'm unmuted. And my question was, what was the draw of Minneapolis? Why?
Yeah. So that's a very good question. Turns out Minneapolis was the wealthiest town beyond Chicago, New York in the 1880s. The key to Minneapolis, St. Paul, is that it is the only place in the Mississippi where there's a drop enough to have mills.
Mm-hmm.
And the grain of North Dakota was brought to Minneapolis where it was milled, and Pillsbury, General Mills, these were all the companies. And in fact, there's a recent book called Grain, which is about how the milling industry in Minneapolis changed the world because it was the main supplier of flour to Russia and Europe in the 19th century. So Minneapolis was booming. And if you ever go to Minneapolis, St. Paul, you will see there are blocks and blocks and blocks of 19th century mansions. It was a very wealthy place.
I have been there a couple times, once for an actuarial research conference at the University of Minneapolis or the University of Minnesota at Minneapolis.
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah,
but-
that's the answer. I mean, he arrived in Michigan. I mean, partly it was also, this is something that's a whole nother angle, is that the HIAS, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, was trying to push Jews out of New York. They wanted to get Jews in the rest of America where they could thrive and not all be in New York. I should also point out here, one of the things that's in the diary is great story. He arrived actually in Castle Garden. This is pre-Ellis Island. Ellis Island didn't open to the 1890s. He arrived in Castle Garden. He didn't have it when he got to Castle Garden, they didn't have enough money to be released. And he tells this amazing story, which I have to believe was true, where the family was held in Castle Garden, and David, being the eldest, was released to take the train to Michigan to find his father. And he has this story of going through Manhattan, trying to find people from his hometown who could give him the money to get to Michigan. He can't afford a first-class ticket, so he has to go to Newark to get a third-class ticket. He finds his father in Milwaukee, who gives him the money that he's made in the last 6 months. He takes the train back to New York to release his family from holding in Castle Garden so they can rejoin his family. And the reason they were in Ludington, Michigan, was that somebody else from Tukums had gone there the year before. So it's chain migration. And then to go to the big city was Minneapolis.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, my mother's family all went to Chicago on that same sort of train migration, and my father's
You're
family
freezing.
pretty much ended up in Detroit for the same reason.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting that they didn't go to Detroit, but Minneapolis, I think, was seen as having better prospects in 1880s. Detroit really became more successful after the turn of the century, but in the 1880s, Minneapolis was it.
Well, I actually have discovered now, listening to your whole talk, we have two crossovers, though I don't know if we are related. In Minneapolis, St. Paul, a bunch of my Perlman cousins went. So Perlmutter, and then somebody married a Shoemeister. And like all the Shoemeisters in Minneapolis are my cousins.
I don't know Shoemeister. My mother's Aunt Sarah married a Charles Perlman. The funniest story about Charles Perlman is he got very wealthy running a business which was selling school uniforms to Catholic schools. I thought that's a great tradition of a Jewish tradition. And what's the other connection?
The other one is Courland, which you were talking about, the German background. My great-grandmother, well, everybody on that side of the family consistently said they were from Kreuzberg, which actually wasn't in Courland once I looked at maps, but they spoke German and Yiddish. My great-grandfather spoke Russian and Yiddish, so the only language they had in common was Yiddish, which was my grandmother's first language.
So Jerry asks about a SIG for Tukums. There is a SIG for Courland, and actually I didn't mention this, but Martha Lev Zion, who sadly died of a lung condition about 7 or 8 years ago, she ran the SIG under Jewish Gen for Courland, and she was incredibly helpful. She ended up moving to Ben Gurion University, and I spent a day with her there before she died. She was incredibly helpful. Janice, do you know, is there still one for Courland?
Well, they've renamed them. They're no longer special interest groups. They're research divisions or some cockamamie term like that. I have no idea why they did that.
But they're through Jewish Gen, or?
If you go to Jewish Gen, there is still a research group for Latvia.
There's one, I think there's also one separately for Courland.
Okay, there certainly used to be, and I think it was carried over.
Yeah, and I haven't looked at that recently, but they've been very, very helpful in this research. I should also say that because Courland was more prosperous, as you saw the town, this is not a shtetl. This is not a Polish shtetl. This is a very established town in terms of the sophistication of the town. One of the things we found in the Jewish archives of the Jewish division of the Latvian archives, they have collected the death records. All the towns in Courland sent their books at some point in the 30s or 40s, fortunately, to Riga. And I was able to look at the 1943 death record of my great-great-grandfather, David Blumenfeld's father, as opposed to his wife, I mean, Ben Zion's father, Yossel, and they are in Hebrew, German, and Russian, not Latvian, but you have the date of death, 1843, and they are, again, this is into the Russian period, and these are books that the Jewish community maintained for the government. So that's why they're in Russian, German, and Hebrew. These have not, I haven't looked back, but as of recently, they've not been digitized, but they're available in those records of there's a whole Jewish division. Rita Bogdanovich is the archivist, and she was incredibly helpful to us. So there's a lot of material from Courland, more than in other parts of Eastern Europe, because they were under the Courland and the Russians. They had very good bureaucrats. They were very bureaucratic. And so there's very good records, actually.
So can you find out about those records through the Latvian archives?
You know, I haven't gone back and looked. I don't think they're on Jewish Gen yet. I mean, this is one of the things you could go to the special interest group, because Marshall Lev Zion, one of their projects had been to digitize these. And I don't know if they've done the death records yet. I just haven't gone back and looked.
Okay. Well, you know, can you contact the Latvian archives directly about them?
Yeah, I'm sure you can.
I
I'm
travel
not
to Latvia.
Rita anymore, but if you go into look at the Latvian National Archives and look for the Jewish section, I'm sure there's an email address for the archivist. It may not be Rita. It was Rita Bogdanovich 10 years ago. I haven't been in touch with her since.
Okay. Hey, it gives me something to hope for, because I still have not found a single European record for that part of my family. They
Yeah.
keep in Kreutzberg. I can't say yes or no because I have no documentation. Does anybody else have any questions for Fred? Speak up, or else I'm going to turn you all back loose on your Sunday.
Okay. Well, feel free to write to me after you look at the book. I'd be happy to communicate about it, and I hope you enjoy reading it.
Thank you very much, Fred. It was a fascinating presentation, and I'm glad you had the time to give to us. And
No, I really enjoy it.
at the Willamette Valley JGS also.
Yes, no, I really enjoy it as well. I'm glad you all enjoyed it.
Thank you. Everybody have a great rest of your Sunday. Look for communication with us about our next upcoming presentation. And
Thank you, Janice, for organizing this.
bye, everybody. I'm going to shut the meeting down.